Welcome. This is the Art of Radical Mentorship. Our moderator will be Lauren Sandler. We have our panelists here. This is Sonamoo Sasame, Courtney Leonard, Jigna Desai, and Paul Briggs. The Art of Radical Mentorship amplifies stories in clay to highlight voices marginalized in institutional spaces. This collaborative effort disrupts the disruption of dominant mythologies as truth and facilitates movement of ideas and actions to achieve equity and transformative power and practice. So please join me in welcoming Lauren Sandler.
We're going to do it from here, if that's all right, so rather than use that pedestal there. So, good morning, everyone, and is that good there? You can all hear me fine? And thank you, Ashlyn, for the introduction and also for the work that you do as one of the student directors at large on the NCECA board. And I'll start by just saying how grateful I am to be here today and to have this opportunity to be in dialogue with the people here on the panel and also in conversation with the community of all of us in the room. This panel for me came about from a desire to connect and to support one another, and I think that the act of coming together is really part of that radical mentorship that we'll be talking about today. As we begin, I want to respectfully acknowledge the Dakota and Anishinaabe on whose territory we stand today, and the Ho-Chunk, who have historic territorial claim to the land as well. And also to extend gratitude to the people who clean and care for this building, the people who built this building, and all those who have been displaced from where we are, the individuals, communities, and generations, those enslaved or exploited against their will. I also want to acknowledge the communities in our lives, our friends, our family, our neighbors, our coworkers, our teachers, and our students whose support and guidance allows us to be here today. To all of those whose invisible and visible labor and love supports us to be here, and those who are not in the room at all. So each one of us will talk briefly first about our ideas of radical mentorship, and we will then engage in a dialogue amongst us around some questions that we put together as a group. After which we'd love to hear from those of you in the room who would like to share their thoughts or have some questions for us as well. So what is radical mentorship is a question I think a lot of us are getting. The Art of Radical Mentorship is a collaborative effort in which mentorship functions as a conduit of knowledge and experience between teachers and students and seeks to amplify voices that are often marginalized within institutional spaces. This process dismantles hierarchies, disrupts the distribution of dominant mythologies as objective truth, and facilitates movement of ideas and actions to achieve equity and transformative power and practice. Radical mentorship investigates the mechanisms of institutional oppression and seeks tools of change through understanding history, legislation, policy, and social justice to make clear the past and current practices of perpetuating and readdressing disparities. Student debt, access to health care, and legal status can dictate student decisions. 36% of college students suffer from food and housing insecurity, and 10% of college students are homeless. Radical mentorship transcends classrooms and canons. We seek or we ask who is not in the room, who tells the story and what stories are not told. We look for cultural context to understand content and examine the imposition of narratives through power. Too often we see structural inequity locate the problems and solutions to economic exploitation, racism, and cultural power imbalances on those most vulnerable and most affected by these disparities. This system indicts communities, privatizes social services, and commodifies support to maintain privilege. Our current climate defunds public education, strengthens corporate universities, and maintains a system of 73% contingent faculty with no job security and few protections for academic freedom, training students for unavailable positions. Instead, radical mentorship addresses the foundation and maintenance of the university and settler colonialism, slavery, labor exploitation, and corporate imperialisms. Of the 5,000 students, or college graduates rather, polled for the Strata Gallup alumni survey, 47% of alumni of color said they had a mentor on the faculty, compared with 72% of white graduates. Consider the structure of AP Art History instruction with an image set that shows 65% from the Western construct, or the so-called Western construct, and 35% from the rest of the world, clearly a misrepresentation of the expanse of global art. And this distorted codification must change. We want to create spaces where curriculum, methodology, and environment reflect and engage students' lived experiences. When a life in the arts means working within systems of wealth for the few at the expense of the many, through radical mentorship, we can disrupt this status. We can create structures of care where the movement centers the slowest and quietest among us. Radical mentorship is the site of resilience and resistance, criticism and commentary. It is a permeable membrane between students and teachers to understand multiple systems of knowledge. And through this fluidity, interdependent communities support, inform, and create empowering change. As Ella Baker, a civil rights activist, stated, I use the term radical in its original meaning, getting down to and understanding the root cause. It means facing a system that does not lend itself to your needs and devising means by which you change that system. Thank you. I'd first like to, Asana will speak after me, and we'll move sort of through the line of us up here. But I'd like to introduce Sana first. So Sonamoo Sasame is a mentor to so many of us. Sana's broad global travel, in her words, is a platform upon which I became a more compassionate and human being. Many of the themes in her work echo what she witnesses and experiences in her travels. Her studio practice addresses issues of gender, place, and time through a reinterpretation of personal and historic narratives. As a tireless advocate and activist, Sana has been traveling to Cambodia for the past 12 years to work with young women and girls who were once in the commercial sex industry. She developed the Apron Project in 2014 to help sustain girls to provide a supplement to their existing incomes. And I got to know Sana when I was gifted one of her aprons from the Apron Project, and I now have a really wonderful small collection of these aprons. And in that exchange, I received so much more than that beautiful garment, but also Sana's dear friendship and mentorship. And through her voice, her artwork, and her action, Sana expresses simultaneous strength and vulnerability, a force of justice and empathy. Sana teaches at Hunter College, John Jay College, Jamaica Art Center, and Public School 36. And please welcome Sana. Thank you, Sana.
So, good morning, everyone. A little hoarse. As a woman and solo traveler around the world, I seek the comfort of women and little girls. They keep me safe in their cultures. They guide me through their lives. They teach me their mother tongue. They love me, and I love them back. I watched their lives very, very closely, and I saw difference, radical difference. And sometimes that difference is heart-stoppingly painful. I read a story about a woman fighting sex trafficking in her homeland. I read it on the train coming home from work one night. And when I got home, I was spiritually sick. Her story cracked my soul open. And I wrote her and just asked her, what could I do? And she said, come to Cambodia and help me. And I did go to Cambodia. I went 12 years ago. I worked with 80 powerful girls who mentored me. They taught me so many life lessons that I'll have for the remainder of my life. I watched their lives each year, knowing that I had to go back the next year and the next year. And I observed that girls who were rescued at 4, 5, 7 survive the education process the Somali mom provides, all these skills she gives them. But a girl who's rescued at 18, 19, 25, 26 stumbles because she has not had the formal education. She can't sit in a classroom at 19 if she was abducted when she was in 4th grade. So those girls end up, after 5 years being in the safe house, fumbling in the society. Some of them end up in karaoke bars. Some of them end up as waitresses, which make them trapped and get back into the industry to survive. So after 9 years of working with the entire population, I began to focus on the girls who were the most vulnerable and developed the Apron Project. The Apron Project came about because my mother was a domestic, and she worked, I grew up in St. Albans, Queens, where I live now, and she worked 8 blocks from where we lived in an affluent neighborhood. And she was trustworthy and honest and good, and so she worked 3 houses on 1 block. And one day, one of the members of the home she worked for asked her to wear a uniform to work. And she didn't like the idea of wearing a uniform. She liked her frumpy, old-fashioned dresses. And so over the weekend, my mother made this beautiful, beautiful pinafore, and she went to work with it after dropping off us at PS 15 when we went to school. And I was so proud of my mother for twisting something and making something beautiful and having the courage to wear it to work that day. And when she walked in the door, the woman she worked for loved it, and she says, "I'll never make you wear a uniform." So every year, January 3rd is my mother's death. She died 40 years ago. So I take that day off and I speak to her. And although I've never heard her voice, I feel her speaking back to me. And the Apron Project came about for the girls that are the most vulnerable, which are the older girls. So I work with 12 girls. I give them 40 aprons a year. We sit down, we figure out the pockets, the color sense. I pay them half of the money. They all drive off on their motorbikes, and then we meet 1 year later. I pay them the other half and give them 40 aprons, and thus has been the Apron Project. I put it on my Etsy store, but with multiple jobs and not enough time, I don't get to the shop, so the aprons have become gifts to many people that I love. I never saw myself as a mentor. I saw myself as a human being doing the work that I must do. Thank you.
Thank you, Sona. I first came to know Courtney Leonard through her work. She deftly examines cultural material and environmental sustainability through abstraction. Courtney is a member of the Shinnecock Indian Nation, and her current work examines or embodies the multiple definitions of breach and exploration and documentation of historic ties to water. Courtney investigates narratives of cultural viability as a reflection of environmental record. She asks, can a culture sustain itself when it no longer has access to the environment that fashions that culture? Courtney's practice disrupts the institutional representation of indigenous art as a monolithic cultural artifact. Her work is in many permanent collections, including the Crocker Art Museum, the Heard Museum, ASU's Art Museum, Ceramic Research Center, and the Pomona Museum of Art. Courtney currently teaches at Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia, and I quickly came to admire Courtney's words as she articulates injustice in numerous forums and supports and inspires so many of us. So please welcome Courtney Leonard. Yeah.
Hakame, hello, Tabutni, thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm Shinnecock from Long Island, New York, or Long Island, New York, if you wanted to test me out. And I think I wanted to switch this up a little bit rather than reading what I wrote. I think I wanted to talk about why I investigate English. English is a second language to our community. We don't have a fluid speaking language. And my work is about looking at this kind of imposed law, this imposed language, and really thinking through it. With English, we have multiple different definitions of entering into a word. And it's really dependent on us what power we give the weight of that word and which direction we take it. And I think that applies to the notion of radical mentorship, because honestly, when I was invited to do this, and I have to really thank Lauren And also Rob for introducing me to Sana this semester. She came to, or last semester in the fall, she came to visit, and we're both graduates of Alfred University. Sana is a graduate from the MFA program, and I'm a graduate from the BFA program. And for whatever reason, when I was looking for mentorship to a certain degree as a BFA student at Alfred, I never heard of her name until, I'm 2000, almost 20 years later, and I had to meet Sana. So, I mean, I think that to a certain degree speaks to the issues that we need to address. Why is it that we are aware of some people and not aware of others, and the magnitude of their work? And so I'm really blessed to be here today with these panelists, and I want to say thank you. And going back to language, though, you know, what does it mean to be radical? And where am I? I should have flipped the whole thing over. I'm a bit of a nerd. I'm a note taker. So, but it talks about this ability to like innovate, to change, to progress, and to advocate. Well, at what point do we do that? Is it only when we're in these institutional roles where we have this like label or this job, or are we all personally responsible for those actions throughout any point in our lives? And so I think, if anything, I would put a call to action to understand that you have authority at any level in your life. And you don't have to seek that moment to empower yourself. You just have to realize that you do have that. It took me a while to figure that out. So I understand if you're 18 and you're just starting out, it's gonna take you a while to share that. But there are people that are going to support you, and just know that you're not alone. I think that was some of the things that I realized when I was going through my studies is, you know, people would say things to me like, are you sure you wanna make that? I did this piece on repatriation. So I don't know if you know, but the majority of collections are housed, about 90% of museum collections are housed in the basement. Some of those basements still have skeleton remains from indigenous communities throughout the country. Repatriation is an act within these institutions to repatriate those remains back to those communities. However, some communities don't have a second ceremony to bury people again. So it's a long process, and I made this piece about repatriation. And just so I don't forget, make sure I remind you to look at this video. I'll just say it right now. Look at this video that RISD put out about 5 or 7 years ago called The Silent Room. Sometimes it becomes difficult to realize that the things that I've gone through are probably the things that Sana and Paul and everyone here have gone through at different generations in our lives. What's unfortunate is it's still happening. So The Silent Room kind of addresses this idea of a silent crit. So I'm going to talk about going back to this piece that I made about repatriation. I made this piece about repatriation. You know, it takes a lot to put yourself out there, and I mean, even right now for me. So it takes a lot to put yourself out there, and you're in a critique, and one of the responses I got from a professor was, "Don't you ever just want to make happy little deer?" And I thought about that, and I still think about that today, because, you know, it's not that I'm not capable of making a multitude of works. I choose what I am allowing you to digest, and what I will not allow you to digest is the thing that is going to make you comfortable. So I'm not giving you that type of native that you want. I'm asking you to stay a little bit longer with this work and ask questions. So you're not going to get a feather. You're not going to get brown skin, although that's everything about my family and community. And you are going to be asked to look into places and spaces and stay a while. And I think that's another aspect of radical mentorship is staying a while, listening, lifting yourself up and empowering, and knowing that it's not just for an institution. You know, I'm thinking we're here today and we're talking about radical mentorship, but you had to pay to be here. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's like, how are we igniting the notion of radical and the notion of mentor in these spaces that still align with institutional protocol. So I guess I'll leave it at that because I can go on forever, but I'm really looking forward to listening. I'm going to practice some listening a little bit more, and thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you, Courtney. Jigna Desai embodies advocacy and justice through her kindness, compassion, and empathy. Jigna's scholarship addresses issues of Asian American, post-colonial, queer, diasporic cultural studies, and critical disability studies. As I navigate spaces of academia and the challenges, joys, and privileges of teaching, Jigna's example provides a path. In my home, we say, "What would Jigna do?" And we ask Jigna. Jigna is a professor in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies and the Asian American Studies program at the University of Minnesota. She has received the All-University Award for Outstanding Graduate and Professional Teaching and the Association of Asian American Studies Excellence in Mentorship Award. She also works with the Minnesota Youth Story Squad to amplify the voices of young people in the Twin Cities. And I'm thrilled to have Jigna with us today, so thank you, Jigna.
Start with my gratitude to Lauren for bringing us together so we can all learn collectively from each other. I don't even think the mic's on. Let me make sure okay, it's on. Great. I think a great deal about mentoring, and I'm honored to be able to think through the various morphologies and shapes it takes with Courtney, Sana, Lauren, Paul, and you all today. The last thing that Lauren mentioned is the Minnesota Youth Story Squad. I co-founded it with my colleague, Carrie Smolkowski. Minnesota, as wonderfully Midwestern as it is one of the most racist states in the country. We have one of the largest racial educational equity gaps in the nation. And this is very striking because it impacts so many communities, African American, Latinx, Southeast Asian refugee, Native American, Somali. And our communities of color, and especially our youth of color, in so many ways are experiencing the ways in which there's a disinvestment in education, public education, higher education, and this is not a surprise to many of you. We don't need to just look at the last scandal where folks are paying $500,000 in order to get into private colleges, Ivy Leagues. It's been stacked for a long time between enrichment, SAT prep, tutoring, whatever. It's stacked so that those who have continue to have more. Those who had a little bit are losing that little bit, and those who didn't have access are losing one of the biggest pathways that we've had in this country for class mobility, and more importantly, for access to certain ways of knowing. And education has been a violent process for many youth in this country, whether it is the quote-unquote boarding schools where Native children were taken, whether it is the school-to-prison pipeline. And so intervening in these spaces as they get continually privatized through charters, through kind of the neoliberal modes that are going on with increase in student debt, it's K through 12 as well as high school. And so our project starts with 8th graders knowing that transition from middle school to high school is a very difficult one, knowing that middle schoolers are a hot mess of identity, social justice, what's fair, what's not fair, what is everyone else thinking and doing, and a clear sense of who they are and who they want to be in those early formations. And so we start with them asking basically 2 questions. Who are you? What's your identity? And what do you want to change in the world? What social justice is important to you? And we have our undergraduates who often first-generation students, students of color who come from some of these communities, work with middle school students every week, working on what is your story, who are you, and what do you want? And we go in there and work with them all spring semester And we have right now going on with them a cardboard artist who is making cardboard armor to talk about what do you need protection from in this world? What do you fear? How do you need to go through the life? When do you need to be camouflaged? When do you need to fight? When do you need to defend yourselves? What are your fears? And they're making armor and playing while they do that. And so art, we have the spoken word artists come in, and at the end they make digital stories about what they want to change. And this, for me, starting in 8th grade, I'm an immigrant, and there was never a place where our stories were being told, whether it was a story of children with disabilities, whether it was immigrant children, whether it was children of color. Those stories were not told in schools, and if there weren't those stories being told, there certainly weren't any mentors who were going to help bring about those stories and facilitate them into the classroom. And somehow, I've had the privilege of working to transform what is appearing in a classroom, whose stories count, and how do they matter. So a lot of what we do in 8th grade is to start that project and then continue on in 9th grade. We want to follow them 9th grade, 10th grade, and so on. But it comes from ethnic studies, it comes from feminist studies, that we must care for each other, that we must care about the stories that are not absent, they're unheard, they're unlistened to. That's not the same thing. Stories have been told for a long time, but they're unlistened to, and they're silenced, and that's a difference that we need to talk about. So for me, mentoring, it's very hard to extract it in so many ways in the way it's understood from the institutions in which we're inhabiting. The youth we work with will tell us that school is like prison, that teachers are like cops. And I can be very ambivalent about helping them, not about navigating that, but creating a space for them to continue rather than smashing it down and building anew. And that's partly what we're trying to do in a different way. And I think about that at the university as well. These systems, these institutions perpetuate the status quo. So if we think about radical mentoring as a process for disruption, then it involves challenging the very institutions that enable some of that mentoring. And that has led to a lot of kind of difficulties for those who are doing it. I'm not talking about myself necessarily, but when you challenge colorblind and genderblind policies, when you call out sexual harassment, when folks resign because of institutional non-response, by kicking open institutional doors, when you challenge the dependence on contingent and precarious labor, or you do these things as contingent and precarious labor, the institution is not pleased. And so radical mentoring must disrupt the violence of institutional standard operating procedures as they continue to differentially harm those who are already vulnerable, marginalized, and oppressed. So for me, mentoring isn't about creating mini-me's. It's not about creating superstars. It's not about even in some ways, passing down knowledge. I think radical mentoring is, and if you look at the word mentor, it comes from when Athena, the goddess Athena, came down to mentor Telemachus. And Telemachus, if I remember correctly, was Ulysses' son, right? Odysseus' son. And she had to come down and say, Telemachus, Penelope's suitors, your mother's suitors are out of control. Go search for your father. So she had to cross-dress, come down, and kick him in the ass. And I kind of think of mentoring like that. You need to make some change. There's a lot of going on that's totally wrong, and it's time to make transformation possible by not abandoning or neglecting the things that need to happen. But I think mentoring also has a cost, and I don't mean just in the institutional sense. There's a lot of burnout people feel, and what happens, I think, in this contemporary moment is that a lot of care labor is transferred to people who are mentors, activists. The state has increased its violence, but also abandoned people. Racial capitalism continues to marginalize folks and erode the kinds of structures that we had. And we do rely on a kind of squad care, taking care of each other. But at the same time, capitalism speeds it up, so there's more to do to survive. So how do we balance the kind of care we need to take care of each other to survive? Because this path isn't sustainable. And the ableism and the capitalism that undergird it really need to be addressed. At one point, I actually had to schedule my bathroom breaks into my calendar because it was so packed. And I realized that was dysfunctional in a way that I really could not sustain. So right now, at the top of my to-do list, it says pee and drink water, right? And so when we get to that stage, we know the system is broken. And I think part of it is that we need to pay attention not only and nurture other ways of knowing that critique, tear apart, but also re-envision the ways we can be together and care for each other. Because at this rate, I think we are all heading toward that kind of burnout, slowly, surely, and some folks are already living at those margins, putting things together with incredible resourcefulness, resilience, and have for centuries. But in that sense, I think we really need to pay attention. So I think the last thing I just want to say is that in understanding care labor as being very important, I want to recognize that it's an intellectual act. It's not just an act that we do on the side, because it's always feminized, but it's an intellectual, creative, and I think in some ways transformative way of thinking and approaching the world. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jigna. As a fellow pincher of clay, Paul Briggs drew my attention with the technique he refers to as pure pinching. This mindful practice creates an object in one sitting, a tangible expression of a contemplative moment. The act of pinching, as Paul describes, followed him along an expansive journey through studying education theory, art education, and theology. His work joins skilled handwork, scholarship, and spiritual practice. Consequently, Paul finds art making as a means of equanimity and transcendence. He also has a series of work addressing incarceration's impact on Black lives. Paul teaches ceramics, art making as spiritual practice, and art education at St. Olaf College. And tonight at St. Olaf, I think from 7 to 9-ish, is an exhibition, the opening for an exhibition called More Than That, Diversity Within Diversity, that's curated by Roberto Lugo. Paul, Courtney, and Sana are in that show, along with a number of other wonderful artists. Some of, I believe, are here in the room today. And the work challenges assumptions frequently imposed upon artists of color and represents the diversity of discourse in multiple communities. So hopefully many of you will be able to make it out to that tonight. So please welcome Paul. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Lauren and the team. I'm honored to be able to sit with you and have this discussion. And thank you all for coming and being part of the conversation as well. Move the mic. How's that? Okay. I had entered the discussion talking about the intellectual and pedagogical courage needed to do this type of work that we described in the classroom and outside of the classroom. We often talk about vulnerability as one of the traits needed, but I think vulnerability points too much at the system's threatening when you push against it. I'd like to focus more on the courage and the stamina and the perseverance that it takes to do this type of work. Angela Davis was on campus recently, and I had the opportunity to ask her, how have you sustained being so active over these many years? And one of the things that she said about self-care is that you won't always be on the front lines of the work. You know, sometimes you'll be assisting and supporting someone else who's at the vanguard. And so, while I think it is very important to help students understand how to make subversive objects and how to make objects that are disruptive, that confrontational ceramics, I think it's also important for students to figure out how you become a person who can absorb such teachings. So I think professors and leaders, absolutely, we have to learn how to not necessarily be the smartest or the most creative person in the room, and really begin to understand our role as teaching from within, and having that dialogue, as we talked about yesterday, that you're sometimes a mentor and sometimes a mentee within that context. I love the concept of the kung fu, the kung fu approach, where if any of you remember the series Kung Fu, where, you know, Grasshopper, you know, when you can snatch the pebble from my hand, it's time for you to leave. And he would give him the opportunity to snatch the pebble from the time that he was a young child to the time that he was older. So the understanding was that inside this young person was a master, okay, excuse the term, that at any point this person could rise to the occasion of being what the master was. So to always approach your students knowing that at any moment, or potentially, that they already have what it is you're trying to bring out of them. So absolutely embracing creative struggle, the acceptance of creative practice of others is of course vital to being a radical mentor, but also being a radical student. So Corita Kent, one of John Cage's teachers, said, "Be self-disciplined. This means finding someone wise or smart and choosing to follow them. To be disciplined is to follow in a good way. To be self-disciplined is to follow in a better way." I think there is a art star mentality impeding our students today. I think somehow in our discussions that we're somehow trying to, that something seeps out in our teachings that makes students believe that they can take the elevator to success. You know, that the achievement that they're looking for, the growth that could be in their work, that you do have to take the stairs. Benjamin Franklin said that art was long, meaning it would take a while to really come to this fruition in your work. Hokusai, as you remember in the beginning of his manga, said that, you know, when I was 20, you know, I could make a line here and there, and you know, when I was 40, I could make a few lines that were meaningful. But when I'm 60 years old, then I'll really be able to make a contribution, okay, to the field. And I'm not trying to impede anyone. I mean, if you're at that point, you're at that point. What are you going to do? A woman shared yesterday that, you know, she sat down at the wheel, and within a time of like 6 months, her professor was saying, "Are you sure you hadn't done this before?" And there are always those people that really just kind of get on my nerves. No, but you know, this idea that your craft will be able to say everything that you want it to say in a short time is not possible. So we have to be able to have a conversation with our mentors and be able to hear and leave that art star mentality behind. Now, I think some of this might have to do, well, let me also say what Jigna said yesterday, that I think some of this absolutely comes from a system that you somehow sense, and I was thinking that somehow sense that is against you, okay? You don't see any of yourself represented, that something about the work that's put out there, the conversation that's had. I would encourage all teachers at all levels, what's the first image that you show your students when they walk into the classroom? We hear Jigna working with students at that young age, to prepare them to be able to think about how do you concretize this philosophical place that you go to in your head. And I don't think when many of us started in this that the goal was to be an art star, right? It was something more internal, and especially as I think about my thinking about art making as a spiritual practice, as being able to find flow experiences in your work. I'm pretty sure we've all come to that place where you don't know what time it is, you have forgotten to eat, you don't go to the bathroom, you don't do all those things because you are just in that flow place. The work has taken you away, and we probably started being in that place when we were very young. And then suddenly, that particular flow and labor that we put in that didn't feel like labor because it was such joy, suddenly someone begins to pay attention to the fruit, to the fruit of that meditative work, and now we are drawn to something else, right? The work begins to take us to a different place. So I don't think we can lay this on students, however. I think it's something about the conversation that we're having in our classroom, maybe as we address people as popular as opposed to someone who's made a craft and content contribution to the field, the time that they've put in, the 10,000 hours or so, if we listen to Malcolm Gladwell, that they've put in to make a craft contribution or a content contribution to the field. I had discussions recently that brought this to mind, which I'm kind of new at this too, and I'd love to hear some pushback. That I find students not able to understand how you took a thought and materialized it into an idea. And also, especially when that idea was very abstract. And I found, and this is very new, I'm finding that our students of color don't come with the same cultural capital of what, quote, art is supposed to look like, and are trying to pull from their own ethnicities and heritages and also make this thing called fine art. And it's quite a struggle for them. So that mentorship is very much needed. This is very recent. A student was admiring the cups of Ann Currier over in the exhibition hall and began to talk to John Gill about the negative space. And John Gill says, no, wait a minute, no. Ann Currier's work is actually, over the years, has been about perceived space. So just those kind of little conversations make a big difference. And also that conversation about, I got questions recently about where does this work come from, and why are you doing it? The work that had to do with the impact of incarceration on Black lives. And I was like, well, it had become, this ideal of incarceration had become something that I took for granted that was in society. I hadn't seen it as a crisis until the movie 13th came out, and then I read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, and I said, well, wait, what I've been experiencing in life is actually a crisis in our society. And I don't have to have been incarcerated myself to care about an issue and then make work about it. For the artists, everything is subject matter. So I think we also are going to have that radical courage, no matter what location we speak from, to begin to cross some of those borders in the classroom. So again, as a man, I know that I enjoy a particular privilege that makes me complicit with the oppression of women, but nevertheless, I still have to have the courage to bring that conversation into my classroom, knowing that I'm also complicit with the problem that I'm addressing. And so, I think some of this comes from social media also, this art star piece, where you don't really get to know the artist in depth. You just kind of see the work and hit like. I think we can do a little better with our hashtags and maybe helping to explain the work or really saying what the work is about. I love that people have been posting their firings that have gone south, okay? Opening up the kiln to pieces that have been destroyed. I like that we're saying. And then people respond, wow, I'm so glad that this happens to you also. Well, it happens to all of us. So understanding what the work is about, where it comes from, radical leadership and mentorship, also may need to push back against this ideal of fast ceramics. We know nothing is fast about ceramics. You rush and you bust. In the classroom, we can slow down and create lenses for seeing that are not simply about beauty and making, but also about the socio-cultural and economic facts that make that work beautiful in a specific way. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. So I'd like for us to maybe come into a conversation with each other a little bit more here. And many of you have brought up a lot of the questions in your individual comments that perhaps we can dive a little deeper into as a group. But perhaps we'll begin with thinking about perhaps some of the challenges of mentorship and how do we mentor within cultures different than our own? And how do we mentor in a way that is not imposing our value system?
Can I speak to that?
Yeah.
I had an experience just came back from Cambodia 9 weeks ago. And so in my packing, I thought to myself, why don't I take some toys to one of my girlfriends who was once the maid in the hostel that I stayed in. So she came and picked me up, and I went and met her year-old and her 6-year-old beautiful little children, and I had the toys, and so I presented the toys to the little boy, and he said, "Kiam po tat." He said, "What is that?" And I said, "Pa, toy." And he picked it out, he smelled it, and he tossed it aside, and then went to an adult wheelbarrow and played with it for the rest of the day. So I looked at my toy, and I looked at the wheelbarrow, the adult wheelbarrow that he picked up, pulled back and forth, and I just took the toy and threw it into the water and said, that I was a mentee. I learned that in the context of where I come from, in his environment, it was totally insignificant. His family, they're farmers. His toy is the instrument that his mother and father used to make a living with. So it flips back and forth all the time. So I'm learning more from my life lessons from my survivors than I could ever learned in the classroom. Sure.
So we talked about like fluidity and transformative and lots of really great words here. I wanted to talk about the fact that I am from one nation of over 565 plus nations in the country. And so just because I happen to be under that parameter of indigeneity or Native American or whatever, I am not from other people's communities. I found that when I personally have gone through wanting more, that I sought out people of color. the funny thing is, though, because my husband always laughs at me, he's like, but Courtney, you don't look like, you're talking to these people about being a person of color, and like, you're the lightest skinned person of color. So like, I also want to acknowledge that, like, my father is Irish, and our society is matriarchal. My brother and my sister have my mother's skin complexion. So it's really interesting when you hear people's conversations about like not acknowledging white privilege and being someone who's very aware of my privilege just amongst the same blood of my siblings. And so I'm gonna go back to the point that I wanna make about seeking out support. I seek out support with the assumption that someone, just because of the skin tone, is capable of supporting me. That's kind of an incorrect assumption. My great-grandmother used to say when, culturally sometimes they say to respect your elders, but my great-grandma told me they have to earn respect too. And so I just kind of am thinking about this idea of assumption, and then thinking about this notion of like observation and practicing the idea of listening. I think we all have things to offer to people, but sometimes when they come, whether it's like coming into your door or coming into that moment where they just want to share something with you, we're walking around at this conference, and I know we're all kind of busy, but when somebody goes to extend themselves to you, try to just take the time to pause for a moment and receive that. That is that action of radical mentorship, right? That's the most radical you can be, is to just be present. So don't assume and listen. It's not necessarily the weight of the people of color, because we screw up too. So.
We can move on to, unless either of you have something to share.
I just want to refer to, someone help me with the first name, Chimamanda Adichie, Why We Should All Be Feminists.
Right.
That book kind of helped me. It's like, you're going to have those hard conversations in your classroom. One of the things I try to point out is that women were encouraged to throw on the potter's wheel around the same time that they fought and received the right to vote. So that making those kind of connections in the classroom, again, it does take a little courage, but I think it's important that we kind of cross those type of borders in our spaces. So.
Yeah, and I think that also, I think of my role as a teacher, as particularly with teaching ceramics, and it's so much of a material with such a vast history that every culture in the world has a relationship to be aware of the power dynamics, I think, of much of the work that we might be referencing or just looking at, that directly or indirectly influences our work. And I think something, Paul, that you said when you were speaking about this sort of context, this social, cultural context of the objects that we might be looking at, and really considering our relationship to that, which is going to be different for every one of us. In establishing an authentic exchange between mentor and mentee, I think that we need to think about the precariousness of life as a student, life in the arts, life in academia, and we've kind of touched on some of these a little bit already. And I think this is a multiple-part question, and so please address any part of this topic. But what are the ethics in preparing students for a life that may no longer be available to them in regards to job opportunities and in regards to the amount of debt that so many students are carrying? Is it ethical to participate in a system that creates and maintains exploited labor for students, contingent faculty, mentors, and mentees? And instead of systems of precarity, can we imagine mentorship relationships that sustain all participants And perhaps this last part of the question is really part of the answer, is can we develop practices and models of mentoring informed by disability, racial, and gender justice?
So I think a lot about the ways in which our students, especially, I teach at a large land-grant state university, and the rising experiences of housing insecurity, the ideas around food insecurity, et cetera, student debt. And I think what Paul was trying to, capture for us so much in that idea of an elevator is that we live in a culture where we do have to, at some level, traffic in an economy in which clicks matter, in which visibility is all about getting a kind of currency that is on social media to capture those 15 minutes of fame, whether you're a Kardashian or an artist, it's still getting eyes on you. And for people growing up in an economy in which the future is really insecure, it may seem like the only pathway they know and understand. And I think providing a critique of the institutions and the systems that create that, because they're very seductive. It's very easy to become Instagrammed and Instagrammable and manage yourself that way. And it's very hard not to, in some ways, participate. And I think what the larger context is in terms of what are we mentoring towards? What are the larger goals beside quote-unquote professionalization or a job? But what are the larger goals that we want to imagine? And I don't dismiss the anxiety of students around their futures, the indebtedness, et cetera. In fact, I think that's very real. Mental health crises for youth from 10 to 34 are high, right? There is so much mental health support lacking in spaces where they're most needed, which is where a lot of our youth are. And so I try to think about then what are we mentoring towards, both in the institution to transform it, or to transform spaces so that they are inhabitable, but also to mentor our youth, our students, to survive, to rely on each other, and to imagine different goals, that the energy that goes into getting clicks or creating kind of pursuing a star, kind of status may seem like the reward, but it isn't, and it's also unending because those 15 minutes fade and the clicks go away, and it's kind of a dream you can't chase all the time. So trying to think about where we put our energy, both in transforming the institution, which continues to perpetuate this, and also building things outside of it, building ways that we create to be sustainable for those who are in that room and those who aren't there either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Malcolm, before the talk, we were talking about what radical mentorship looked like, and he brought it. Malcolm Mobutu Smith, he brought it right down to earth and said, sometimes we just have to be radical in how you might have to help me, radical in how we get students to see what the pathways are to getting into graduate school, for applying for shows and for doing all of those things, that we might have to be radical. And I was hearing sacrificial in the time that we give to make that happen. I look at the work of Roberta Lugo also, and just bringing people in, just constantly trying to bring people in and show them and introduce them to the field and introduce them to others and get that network going. We always have. It's always just a different atmosphere, when all the people of color get together in one room and just begin to share. And I think we'll know our work is done when we're all in the same room together and we have that same kind of feeling of not being vulnerable, and not worrying about that. So I really love the way you word that type of anxiety that students have. So.
I was just thinking of ways to practice extending community. So like for me with my Instagram, it's really like a mishmash of my whole life, and I find it to be my public journal. I have practiced like a community practice that I grew up with, which is acknowledging people. So you can take a photo and then tag them, and in that way I'm saying thank you. You know, I'm kind of saying I acknowledge you, and that's how I can maybe switch it up a bit, like empower this action. I do believe that I am not an example of coolness in terms of publicness, but what I always think about is false truths, like this idea of we need to be honest with one another. That's the only way we're going to empower one another. So when you do share those posts about your work, I think it's interesting within the field of craft and ceramics that often to a certain degree, depending on the conversation, it comes with this idea that your touch has to be amongst all of the work. And when we look at some of our rock stars and the way that they are perceived within the world, we are not acknowledging that their work is no different than Damien Hirst and 5,000 Butterflies. There are many hands involved to create this idea. We don't tend to share that truth because it's almost like, let's not talk about that in ceramics because our hands must touch everything. But that is a false truth, and we need to kind of work on that, because if we worked on that, then our younger people would know how much it takes to create this illusion. But that illusion is also a truth. So it's like this balance of false truth. And I think that if we shared more honesty, like I really appreciated how you mentioned about the failed kilns, the broken pieces, the fractured legs, the disembodied rotary cuffs, the arthritis that we receive in our hands from throwing over and over and over again, and what is the right position and what is the wrong position. You know, those are things that we need to push forward a little bit more and acknowledge that there's nothing wrong with that is a part of the practice. That is a part of our skill set, and that is a part of how we're going to advance the field. So, yeah.
I would like to add that in my 12 years in working in Cambodia, I've had my low points of wondering how effective I am in the work that I do. How can an apron save a girl's lives? And then I hear this echo from my mother that lives are not saved in bundles, they're saved one by one. And Ren, who is the manager of the Apron Project, was sold by her mother at 12. Sapira, her daughter, is 5. She will not sell her. Somalia has also taught me that the girls have to have many, many, many dreams, not just one. And it's helped me with working 40 years in my material and still emerging that I have to embrace other dreams. And the other thing that I think is also important is that we can do the work of the heart, but we also have to build institutions that maintain the work that goes beyond us. And I struggle with that because I'm just me. I don't know how to build bigger and still hold on to my love of making ceramics as well. So I need help with that.
Perhaps that can kind of lead us into talking about ways that we can transform institutions a little bit more. And so this is kind of another multiple part question. So how do we teach students, and also how do students educate teachers to dismantle systems of inequity in the art world and in educational spaces? And how do we generate and perpetuate legacies of action when institutions are primarily seeking to replicate themselves rather than transform themselves? And to add to that, I think this was brought up earlier, when and how does one work to transform the institution? And when does one create things outside the scope of the institution, which some of you are doing in different ways?
It seems the greatest factor for change on college campuses today is the students. You know, students are sitting in, having protests, writing letters, sending out blanket emails. I think the students, and I think once the students begin to do that, they need to be able to find allies among the faculty. You know, my school, St. Olaf, like all schools, are struggling with this, and the students are trying to keep them moving towards that work. And we have a group of dedicated faculty who are standing beside them and having that conversation. And the administration you just can't look the other way. As Dr. King said, you know, if the nation returns to business as usual, you know, so we have to remember that this is slow work. It's not going to happen overnight, but we have to keep our hands to the plow and just continue to have the conversation. And schools that are dedicated to do it, as I'm always telling our leadership, you know, you have to mention this every time the body comes together. Every time students come together, every time staff comes together, every time faculty come together, say something about equity and inclusion. You know, so that it becomes part of our normal thinking, you know, about what should happen in the institution.
I would love some statistics on our field. I went to Alfred, and I went to RISD, and I always kind of wondered when I didn't get a job, what am I doing wrong? Because I thought I played the game well. And what I realized is I was entering in a game I didn't even need to be in to begin with. How many people in our field come from Alfred? How many people in our field come from Cranbrook? Who are they teaching, and how have we given an opportunity for other voices within our field alone? Just do the statistics. How many women of color are tenured in our field? I tried to post that, and I got no response. So if any of you know that answer, I'm kind of looking for statistics, because sometimes when you do numbers, then people listen. They're kind of like, oh, wow, I get it now. I can see it. You have a point, Courtney. You're not just bitching all the time. And so I think that's something that I want to encourage is how do we develop multiple languages aside from English if we're only empowering English? How do we develop multiple ways of entering into a conversation if the conversation is coming from the same place? How do we allow our students to realize that there are multiple ways to do this? And you don't have to go to this place, to then this place, to then this place, to then have your clicks get you the next job. That's the other aspect of false truths. We're not being honest with ourselves. We're developing more people coming out of these MFA programs with this kind of false illusion that if you do it all well, you're gonna have a chance. Well, you're not. You're not.
That's right.
So, so you have to do or die, and you have to survive, and you have to make your own ways to go about doing it, and you have to have faith, and it's not an easy thing, but hey, you chose art.
It's come to the point where I really hate the word diversity, right? If the word diversity is in the email, I kind of want to say, no, thank you. I'm not going to come to your invitation, panel, meeting, conference, whatever it is going to be, because that word within institutions means, can I add you +1 so that we can have a brown person, black person's, person at the table? And so that just, I was like, let's just talk about reparations. Maybe that would be the better frame we start with. And so that's, So let's talk about what your knowledge is based on and who it's stolen from. Let's talk about who built these buildings. Let's talk about these very different conversations about the fact that when you claim the knowledge that is being made within these spaces, there have been other hands, other minds, other bodies, and other things that have contributed to that that are not about the person who's there. So we did actually have a symposium. I'm part of I co-founded a group on campus that is all the ethnic studies departments, gender, women's sexuality studies. We go by GWiz. It's a lot better for us. And they wanted to collapse us into one unit, and we formed race, indigeneity, gender, and sexuality studies, RIGS, instead, so that we could be bigger. They wanted to take away the 6 seats at the table and make it one. And so that's their version of diversity. So RIGS just had a symposium last year on reparations. What does it mean when the building was built by slave labor? What does it mean when it is on indigenous land, and so on? How do we actually think about restorative justice? And what are the practices that we have to do in order to restore a certain sense of justice? Because we owe so many who are not in the rooms in which these conversations are happening. And there are small practices, and I think Courtney was getting at like very concrete things of like who you promote or what you promote. I have a citation practice where I'm like, I will cite graduate students, junior faculty, untenured people, scholars in the community, people of color, queer, trans folks, before I cite tenured faculty, dead faculty, a lot of different scholars. I will cite quote unquote down. Because I need to lift the voices who have less privilege than I do. How do we then make the institutions also think about restorative justice? And if we framed our knowledge in art making as always, in some ways, this phrase that I've used before based on a conversation between Jessica Campbell, who's Métis, who is thinking about honorable thievery. Is Jessica Campbell? I'll have to. Sorry, I can't remember the conversation. But Helen Hoy talks about it. It's honorable thievery. That our knowledge is stolen in many ways because we don't acknowledge the conditions that make it possible, the people that it's dependent on. And so if we're going to be honorable thieves in this work, as we make all kinds of knowledge and art, then we also need to be accountable to those we have stolen from and continue to rely on in so many ways in the spaces we are at.
Hello? On here? Okay, so my question to you is, how do we involve the other side of the people in that conversation of reparations? And within the art community, we have lots that don't know what it feels like to struggle with being black, or they don't know what it feels like to struggle with being a minority, and they're automatically made to be like the bad guy in some cases, and not, how do we acknowledge them as relevant and still let them have a place in this and not be so pushed to the outside before they even have a chance to know what the issue is?
I think that's a great question. One thing I think about, and I'm sure you all have responses too, is I try to talk to my students about what, especially my white students, about what did you not learn? What is it the privilege denied you access to knowing? And aren't you sad and mad that you didn't have, you've been narrowly put into this frame of reference and knowledge, and you only know this? Aren't you sad that you don't know the richness of the world around you? And what are you going to do? Unlearn that. And if you think about it metaphorically, you were given a bank account that somebody put money into. You didn't earn it. You didn't ask for it, but now you have it. What are you going to do with it? So how do you take responsibility for what you don't know? And you should still continue to unlearn the things that you have been taught that are the only ways of knowing. And then what are you going to be responsible for in transforming so we can do this together? Yeah. And you were talking, I think, about being an ally, what that looks like yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, can't you be an ally that is like afraid and uncomfortable? Like, I mean, because I am every day. So I think that like acknowledging that when someone feels, I think maybe some of those feelings that is there that you were saying, that's okay. And then like, let's go from here, right? So at the same rate, I am a little bit concerned about who gets to tell our stories. And I don't personally feel that allyship is someone telling a narrative that is not their own. Not at this point. I think that if we can allow people who come from those narratives more equity in the field to share that, then we can bring in the other allies, right? So is an allyship taking the place, or is an allyship standing alongside you or even behind you? Yeah, you know, let's get our stories out a little bit before people start being the representative of those stories so they can help us get the word out. We can do it ourselves, you know? That's an okay thing. Like that, let's work on that for a little bit. But yeah, I always think it's amazing that we always look for making other people comfortable. You know, when have you done that for me? So if you feel uneasy, that's all right. That's where we got to go from. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that
I just wanted to say, I hope
Yes, Donna.
oh, all right. I don't know. I have a hard time with microphones and stuff. But anyway, I'm a person of color, as we all see, with a disability, and it took me a long time to come out here because I agree with you in telling my story and trying to figure out how to tell my story and not allow other people to tell it is one of the reasons that kept me from coming out. And it's one of the reasons that kept me from coming out in the public about ceramics. But now I feel better. This is my first year coming out as a and showing and telling my story by writing and telling the world about who I am, and then trying to collaborate and work with other people who are like me, trying to tell their stories. And thank you for inviting.
Thank you. I think it's very much also, I find it's my responsibility as an educator to address the mythologies that many of us have been brought through within this sort of, if we're talking about ceramics, this canon of ceramics. And which is often, I think, in our field, this very Eurocentric perspective with this East Asian fascination, right? And it's presented as the canon. There's a lot there to learn from, to look at, to absorb, but when it is presented as the canon, so many of our stories, our histories, are left out. And, you know, and then, you know, how do we bring ourselves into the room, you know, when we don't see ourselves there? And so I feel as an educator, it is my responsibility to critique those narratives, you know, to deconstruct them, to demythologize them. And then for us to come together to really examine the more of the reality of the expansiveness of this material that we're talking about, and I guess just in reconsidering what the narratives in which many of us are sort of raised through, and then perpetuate, right? It continues on, and like we have to just, you know, stop those stories and create those spaces where a multiplicity of voices an abundance of narratives can be present and hold space. We can please continue. We have we have more time. I don't know where the microphone is, but if you could, we could just spend the rest of the time people asking questions.
Yeah, I just hit myself in the face with this mic. I mean, first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge the level of scholarship and intellect that's here. And, you know, if anybody in this field should be an art star, it should be the people that are sitting at this table right now because, yeah, can you please? And I think you are. And I think one of the things that I'm curious about is sort of, you spoke a little bit about the egalitarianism of mentorship, how it's not sort of an age thing, it's not a, you know, top-down thing, it's sort of rhizomatic, you know. And so my question to you is, you know, one of the things that I see or that I feel as a person of color, I mean, it's also really great that you spoke a little bit about self-care. Because I think one of the things that winds up happening is often when folks seek mentorship from a person of color, we're sort of like pigeonholed into only being able to offer advice about certain things. So a few years ago, Malcolm Mobutu Smith and I, we were talking about the Theaster Gates talk, and Theaster was great and all, but one of the things he said was he was talking about making bricks and hiring a white man who knew a lot about science to make the bricks, right? And we were talking about like why, you know, why can't it be a person of color? Like why are we sort of seen just as sort of having conversations about social constructs and not about technical aptitude or material science and all the things? Because the folks on the stage are not just scholars, but they're also like master, you know, makers of things, right? And so what I'm curious about is like, in terms of you know, your self-care and when you're offering mentorship, you know, how do you sort of navigate or you know, allow the people that are seeking your mentorship to know that you can offer more, or that you're about more than just like the thing that they think they know you for? Because I think that's one of the things that's really exhausting is you want to have more conversations than just diversity, right? Like I want to be able to sit down with a student and talk about celadons, and I want to talk about, you know, clay bodies, and, you know, I'm a ceramics professor, and all I ever talk about is identity politics, right? And so I guess my question to you is how do you folks navigate that and sort of guiding the conversation to sort of expand and challenge a lot of the stereotypes that people think we're sort of limited to?
Can we get the microphone over? Thank you. Malcolm, did you want to say something? Okay. Okay, gotcha. Thought you were going to. Does anyone here want to jump into have a response to that?
This year in Cambodia, I go for 6 weeks, and I spend all 5 weeks with the girls, getting up at 7 in the morning and working until about 6. And I never really get tired like I get tired here. Am I exhausted from being on the train 5 o'clock in the morning and going up and down the steps with luggage and stuff? I never really get tired there. I'm energized by these survivors who have given me so much. But this year I got sick for the first time, and I laid down while they sewed around me. And then I looked up at Rin, and she looked down at me, and I said, you know, this is supposed to be a vacation for me too. And so I said, one day I'm not coming in. I'm going to stay in my room, and I'm going to look at TV, something I never do in New York. And she looked at me, and she said, no, one day we go to the mountains. And so what we did was we gathered their mothers, and I met their mothers for the first time. Their mothers who are also survivors, their mothers who are victims of the Khmer Rouge, and we went to the Gold Mountain. We spent the entire day. And so just reminding them that, yes, I'm here for you 6 weeks, but let's stop one day and make it a sauna day. And so that's something I'm going to incorporate more. But it was getting sick this year in Cambodia that made me realize that I needed a sauna day. And also looking at the beautiful images, Sid, that you sent me when you were traveling in Italy, I think, And I realized by looking at your images, I'm not on vacation in Cambodia. I'm working my ass off. So I thought to myself, this is my 12th year. I've been back 8 weeks. Next year I'm going to go. The next year I'm not going. I'm going to make the girls work without Sana. I'm going to make them work without me. I'll never not go back, but I'm not going to go back year 14. Yeah.
Thank you guys for being here, and I just want to make an observation about my own experience, give you some anecdotal data. I've been teaching in universities for about 25 years, and I thought my mere presence would be a beacon for people of color. And I've had a total of 1 African-American student as a major. Wow. So that's just a piece of frame of reference. But I feel that my radical mentorship, my role as a teacher, is to be present for the 99% of the people that I do teach, which are all the white students that I have, which are fabulous, and I'm there to educate in that way. And I'd like to hear some reactions to you guys about that real world fact. I mean, when I came into Clay, I could count on one hand the African American mentors that I could see around me. All of my main mentors are from the other class of people. So the fact of the matter is I've had great success. I want to be a beacon, but the people I'm speaking to are the people that we need to change, or the people we need to educate. They're not the young people, the African American people, they're not there. The filter is happening far before they get to the university, right? How do we deal with that?
Filter.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say, listening to all of you up there, it's hard not to notice how you are speaking about very mindful practices in your own lives and how you have encountered yourselves and faced yourselves and your demons and how to exist as a human. And I think to go back to how do you teach glazed chemistry and then also care for the human in front of you? It's learning how to care for yourself. And I hear that healthy dialogue within every one of you, words like practice and being present and just having the integrity to say something and the courage to have voice. And I think that this is what we do when we create art anyway, right? So thank you for your words. And more so, thank you for your own practice in your own lives and your own transformation.
Hi, I'm Sid Carpenter. I teach at Swarthmore College. And this is in response to Roberto's question about...
Just point it, yeah. Just point it.
Okay. How about that?
Yep.
Okay. I'm responding to Roberto's question. I teach at a small liberal arts college. Primarily, the population is majority Caucasian students. And I think that just my presence, of course, is that first step. Being there as a woman of color, of a certain age, all of those things, because that shatters some expectations and stereotypes about who should be in the classroom. And I find that the students are very, very much surprised often, but gratified that I am there and that the knowledge that I'm imparting, the stories that I tell, the experiences that I present to them, in that way, that fosters that kind of change that we're looking for in terms of the expectations of a majority population about their expectations about who they assume to be a minority and where knowledge comes from. Who has knowledge, who has the facility, has the experience to bring that knowledge out. So in saying that, I think that it is important that institutions, colleges, universities, make sure that they bring more faculty into their communities to represent the knowledge and experience that we have, and that it's there. It's a resource that is not being mined sufficiently in terms of who's there, who's got knowledge, and what kind of knowledge they can bring to these institutions. So I just think, once again, to make that point, is presence is key to this dilemma about ignorance among the majority population.
It is just to, unfortunately, it is after 12, and I know there's other things that need to happen in this room, and the objective here, I think, is also for this conversation to continue, to not end here, for it to continue amongst us in small groups and large groups. Thank you all, and thank you and everyone for being here, and I think there's obviously a need for this to continue. I appreciate you being here. So, stay in contact, and let's keep talking about it, please. And we're here for the rest of the weekend. Thank you.